Favorite TMNT episodes, favorite TMNT episodes, favorite TMNT episodes, reviewing every series, Turtle Power. Previously, these are my top 20 favorite episodes of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise. Number 5, Raphael meets his match. Number 4, The Old Switcheroo. Number 3, Splinter No More. Number 2, Turtles on Trial. And finally, number 1, Corporate Raiders from Dimension X. Number 5, The Tale of Master Yoshi. Number 4, Worlds Collide. Number 3, Same as It Never Was. Number 2, Head of State. And finally, number 1, Turtles in Space! But as good as it was, we must now move on to the next attempt at a franchise reboot. Clocking in at 5 seasons with a grand total of 124 episodes, Nickelodeon's first go-round with this franchise was a massive success, with many considering it to be one of the best incarnations of the Turtles to date, and I can see why. Although it takes on a more serious tone than the 80s show, it's not as dark as the 2003 incarnation, though it definitely has its moments. We'll get to that later. Rather, it finds a nice middle ground between the two extremes. In fact, I've come to the conclusion that the 80s series and 2012 series mirror each other. Think back to the days when you acted out adventures with your action figures. 2012 is how epic it looked in your head. The 80s series is how it actually looked. That's the best way I can describe it. Speaking of interpretations, these Turtles are the most young and inexperienced in comparison to past incarnations. They start off being extremely naive to some of the most basic things in the world and can barely function as a unit, but gradually develop their skills and mature as time goes on, until they eventually become the unstoppable fighting team they're famous for being. The show is definitely made with kids in mind, in the sense that most episodes have some kind of lesson to teach, such as internet safety, being a good friend, taking responsibility for your mistakes, respecting your elders, etc., just blown up to superhero proportions. April O'Neil has also been aged down considerably, but is given a more mysterious, out-of-this-world backstory and gradually comes into her own, learning ninja skills alongside the Turtles. And unlike past versions, we get to see her periodic training on screen, showing her progress. She is, no question, the 5th Ninja Turtle more than any other incarnation. Unfortunately, the same can't be said of Casey Jones, who doesn't get nearly as much development as he did in 2003. He, much like everyone else in the cast, is also much younger, but retains the spirit of his past incarnations, a tough street kid who wears his heart on his sleeve and is ready to defend his friends and city with nothing but a hockey stick and some homemade gadgets. There's also the matter of Master Splinter. Although I prefer the versions where he's a rat to begin with, if they had to go with the version of him being Hamato Yoshi, then this was the best, most compelling take on it. We'll get into his backstory later on. But in the earlier seasons, the writers seem to have taken a bit of the Mr. Miyagi route, in that he's there to give sage advice, but he's not above telling a joke or telling his students that they're being too serious and not everything has to have a deep meaning. He seems to go the route of letting his sons figure things out for themselves rather than just monologue to them constantly. He gets a little less jokey as time goes on, but one thing about him I appreciated that stayed consistent was that even he makes mistakes sometimes and apologizes to his sons whenever he wrongs them. Up to this point, Splinter always seemed to be portrayed as this near-faultless ninja master who always had a plan or answer for everything. So here, it's nice to get a Splinter who isn't perfect, as it shows that adults can also screw up and have much to learn as well. As for the villains, I'll get into a few of them more in depth a little bit later on, but in short, holy cow is the villain roster a mile long on this show. This series has a huge emphasis on mutants and monsters, most of them revamped versions of characters that appeared in past incarnations. If a new human villain is introduced, I guarantee you there's a 98% chance they're gonna be mutated into something at some point. Gotta sell those toys after all. And the unique art style style lends itself well to this. It's mostly 3D, but with a blending of 2D, often making it look like a comic book or Japanese manga leaping off the page. Sometimes I couldn't tell where the 2D ended and the 3D began. The animation is incredibly fluid and energetic, able to capture all sorts of poses and camera angles not seen in any previous shows. There's also tons of references to past turtle incarnations, as well as all sorts of movies, comics, and genres in general. Most notably, the various TV shows the gang watches in each season, which are hilarious send-ups of Star Trek, Voltron, and Hanna-Barbera superheroes. However, this show isn't afraid to get dark and disturbing, and has the guts to take familiar characters and tropes of this franchise and completely turn them on their heads. When it gets silly, it gets really silly, but when it decides to go dark, it gets really dark. Even more so than the 2003 show. I'm shocked certain episodes were even allowed to air on TV, a few of which we'll get into in a moment. Overall, despite just a few plot threads here and there that were left dangling, the 2012 series was pretty good. Without spoiling too much, the ending to Season 4 is basically the true conclusion, with Season 5, which was renamed Tales of the TMNT, just being like, and here's a few bonus stories for you. And speaking of stories, here now are a few quick runners-up. Much like 2003, this was another instance where I had a hard time picking only 5 features, as there's so many good stories in this show. While there were plot threads that carried on throughout a season, this series had more of a focus on one-and-done Monster of the Week stories, and most of my picks consist of what you'd probably consider standard adventures. But they're the best examples of said formula. Most of the other episodes listed in the runners-up, while arguably better and or more compelling from a technical standpoint, are also parts of complicated storylines that I'd have to spoil tons of plot info just to get to the point of why I liked them. Annihilation Earth and Owari being the biggest examples of this, so just bear in mind most of these picks may not have end-of-the-world stakes or anything, but they're great examples of why kids and adults tuned in every week to watch radioactive sewer mutants save the day while eating pizza. With that out of the way, let's get started with Number 5, I, Monster. So as stated earlier, most of this show's heroes and villains were pulled from prior incarnations and given a revamp and fresh coat of paint with various results. But of all the Turtles villains, the one that was done the most justice was the Rat King. He appeared quite a few times in the 80s series, commanding an army of rats via a magic flute like an evil Pied Piper, which worked fine enough for the era. Then, oddly enough, he was given only one episode in the 2003 reboot, though he's never given a name. My guess is that the writers intended to bring him back, but for some reason that never panned out. And ironically, his debut episode in that series was also called I, Monster. So suffice it to say, the Rat King was a character that was periodically around, but arguably never really used to his full potential. Until now. In what became the first true scary episode for me, we're introduced to a mad scientist, Dr. Victor Falco, who in a previous episode was conducting experiments to try and give humans telepathic powers. But when an accident causes a fire to break out in the lab, he's subsequently injured and mutated, with his formula giving him total communication and command over rats. He then hatches a plan to take over New York City with the Turtles at his mercy when their own sensei is brainwashed into serving their arch enemy. At first, this may sound like your stereotypical plot if you've seen the Rat King's past versions, and in a way it is, but the main huge difference here is all about the setup and presentation. Here, we're given a much clearer and frankly better reason how Falco is able to control rats, and as for his design, good lord, just look at him. He's a skeleton crossed with a mummy crossed with a zombie with big red glowing
bioluminescent eyes of hate.
Like, what art director signed off on this? I mean, I like it, but were they just trying to give kids nightmares? And speaking of kids and nightmares, this episode taps into a primal fear many kids might have, or unfortunately already dealing with, when Master Splinter falls under the Rat King's spell. It's the first time we ever really see him leave the sewer lair, and we see just how skilled and dangerous he actually is when, scariest of all, all, he's forced into fighting his own sons with the intent to kill them. How horrifying would it be for your loving parents to suddenly turn on you without warning? And how do you fight an enemy that literally has eyes and ears everywhere? The Rat King represents Splinter's inner demon, his fear of losing himself to his animal side, a factor that would be revisited from time to time, but I think this episode is where that question was tackled the best. I won't spoil how our heroes managed to get out of this one, but needless to say, in the span of just one episode, the Rat King was used to his fullest terrifying potential with an unforgettable design and legit jump scares worthy of a mainstream horror movie. He's honestly one of the scariest villains the show ever produced, dare I say even more so than the Shredder. It just goes to show how a bit of imagination and retooling can turn a mid-tier antagonist into an A-level villain. Number 4, Baxter's Gambit. As mentioned earlier, this series had a heavy focus on mutants and monsters of the week. Seriously, every time the theme song opening sequence was altered, their villain roster just seemed to get bigger and bigger. Some of them were more developed than others, but the two that became this show's staple were Fishface and Dog Pound, later to become Razor. Considering they were Shredder's main henchmen for the longest time, they were basically this series' Bebop and Rocksteady. You know, before the show actually got Bebop and Rocksteady. There was also Baxter Stockman, who has been one of the Turtles' most frequent enemies since the franchise's beginning, and much like his 80s counterpart, he begins as a regular human who is the classic mad scientist archetype who feels he was wronged by humanity and wants to get back at those who mocked him. Yeah, good luck with that, buddy. That should go oh so well for you. Anyway, the episode in question comes about when Stockman gets fed up with being humiliated by Dog Pound and Fishface in front of Shredder, and being constantly defeated by the Turtles doesn't help, so Baxter seeks revenge by luring both the Turtles and Shredder's main henchmen together and ensnaring them, where they're all subjected to a deadly labyrinth with the aesthetic appeal of Mad Mod, Indiana Jones-inspired traps, and flying spike balls straight out of Phantasm. Seriously, did Stockman make a deal with the Tall Man or something? In any case, now both hero and villain must form an uneasy alliance to find a way out of this massive death trap. How Baxter managed to whip together this fatal edition of American Ninja Warrior in the span of just a day or two is anyone's guess. The real highlight of this episode is the Turtles' interactions with two of their arch enemies whom they're forced to work with to stay alive. It's really interesting to see the two sides working together so well. I was totally expecting a stereotypical double cross to happen and was pleasantly surprised when it never did, showing that for as bumbling as Dog Pound and Fishface could be at times, they were smart enough to know when it was in their best interest to call it truce. And speaking of these two, we're also treated to a series of flashbacks that detail the origin of how this pair of mutants came to work for the Shredder and why they remain loyal to him despite all the abuse dished out at them. In most superhero media, villains tend to have armies of thugs, goons, and henchmen who basically serve as cannon fodder for the heroes to beat up. They're essentially treated as cardboard cutouts, and I doubt most audiences are even giving a second thought to who any of these people might be. So it was a refreshing surprise to have an episode that cast a spotlight on two secondary villains and went through the trouble of explaining why they turned out the way they did. The writers didn't have to do this, but it's that little bit of extra effort that made this turtle incarnation overall more enjoyable to watch. As for how our heroes and villains escape Baxter's funhouse of doom, you'll just have to watch and find out. Let's just say it leads to one of the funnier episode endings that shows how self-aware this series could be, sometimes even more so than the 80s cartoon. Number 3, Rise of the Turtles Parts 1 and 2. Not to be confused with the title of the next series to come, we're now going all the way back to the two-part episode that kicked everything off. After being thoroughly impressed with the 2003 incarnation, 2012 was going to have a lot to live up to. So imagine my pleasant surprise when this two-parter turned out to not only be one of my favorite episodes, but is, in my opinion, the best of all the pilots of any TMNT show. The 80s one is pretty good, though it's a whopping 5 parts long, takes a few detours here and there with the neutrinos and the Mausers, and ends with an alien invasion. That's the sort of thing you usually save for a season finale, not the pilot. 2003 is also fine, though it does the opposite and takes its time. arguably a little too much time. Most of the first episode is the gang just wandering around the sewers looking for a new lair, with April not showing up until like the third episode, I think. This beginning, however, hits that sweet middle ground of not throwing everything at us at once, but not dragging things out either. It all starts on the Turtles' birthday of all days, or Mutation Day as they call it, and after a quick explanation of how the Turtles and their sensei all got mutated, the foursome convince Splinter that they're finally ready to explore the surface world, which he hesitantly agrees. We're then treated to a series of funny moments in which the Turtles experience New York City for the first time. Interesting how in all other versions it's been made clear the four have gone topside in the past periodically, but here we get this funny contrast where the Turtles may be expert fighters, but they're painfully naive about other stuff, including the iconic pizza. Things then take a turn when our heroes witness a young April O'Neil and her dad get kidnapped by a bunch of brain aliens disguised in robot bodies. Who are these malevolent extraterrestrials, and what do they want with April and her dad? It'll be up to the Turtles to finally leave the confines of their lair and save the day. And under the span of an hour, we get an action-packed, character-driven, tightly written plot that gives us a ton of info without feeling rushed, and sets up a lot of interesting stuff to come. We're given the first hints of a bigger looming threat, but the writers knew to not whip out their ace cards too early. We get just the right amount of slow moments to establish our main cast, but not to the point of putzing around either. April isn't Black Widow, but she's not a wimp either. Splinter is a wise teacher, but isn't above admitting when he's wrong. The Turtles have much to learn, but you want to see them succeed. It just checks all the boxes of what a good pilot should be, and it got me excited to binge the rest of the show. Proof positive how important first impressions can be. Number 2, Tale of the Yokai. Nothing will probably ever top Same as It Never Was from 2003 in terms of raw tear-jerking emotion, but this is a close contender, and wouldn't you know, it's another time travel story, and easily one of the best time travel stories of the entire franchise. In a previous adventure, the Turtles met Renette, a young woman who's in training to become a time guardian, which, side note, she also made occasional appearances in 2003, but she is far more likable and competent at her job in this version. Anyway, while on the return trip home, the Turtles are forced to make a pit stop in Japan. Over a decade and a half in the past, where to their shock they see a younger Hamato Yoshi, pre-mutation of course, his wife Tang Shen and their daughter, and his once friend turned rival Oroku Saki. And in their attempt to return home, the Turtles will witness the events that caused their sensei to lose everything he held dear at the hands of the man who will eventually become the evil and deadly Shredder. And just maybe the Turtles will discover they're more intertwined with the fate of their ninja master than they ever imagined. I mentioned earlier how surprised I was that certain episodes were even allowed to air. This is one of those. As silly as this series could sometimes get, it also wasn't afraid to give us mature, compelling stories that are arguably on par with Avatar: The Last Airbender, and this is easily their saddest, most dramatic episode of the entire show. The loss of Splinter's original family was a backstory hinted at periodically, with a few tidbits I don't want to spoil, but here now the record is finally set straight as to what really happened, and what we get is a tale of romance, deception, rivalries turned deadly, jealousy, and caught in the middle are the Turtles, who argue over whether they should let history play out as it did, or should they intervene and try to give Splinter a happier future, even if it means they would cease to exist. It goes to show how selfless our heroes are, that they're willing to sacrifice their own existence to make their father happy. But most heartbreaking of all is the fate of Tang Shen, who tries to serve as mediator between everyone and pays the ultimate price for it. At first, this bears a lot of similarity to the previously discussed Tale of Master Yoshi episode from 2003, although this time Tang Shen is fleshed out quite a bit more and given way more personality and screen time than she ever got previously. Even better, the Turtles, posing as mystical creatures, are given the opportunity to meet her and talk to her, and her interactions with her husband's future family make her death all the more tragic, as she would have been a great mother, both to her daughter and the Turtles if fate dealt a different hand. With lessons in the evils of selfishness and the dangers of being consumed by jealousy and rage, the next time someone dismisses TMNT as being nothing but stupid and ridiculous, show them episodes like this to prove them wrong. And finally, number 1, Lone Rat and Cubs. There are countless numbers of TV shows that start to lose steam in their later to final seasons, whether it be because of budget cuts, the plot going in a direction fans didn't like, keeping the show going way past the point it was intended, or the writers running out of ideas. And the first 2 incarnations of TMNT were sadly also victims of this. Let's just say not too many people look back on the Red Sky episodes with fondness, and don't get me started on Back to the Sewers. But 2012, on the other hand, in my eyes anyway, finally broke the curse and continued to give us entertaining epic adventures right to the very end. Granted, most of the final season was comprised of multi-part stories, save for one. Narrated by Master Splinter and told entirely in flashback, were taken through the early days of the Turtles' lives, back when they and their sensei were only recently mutated. And so, night after night, Hamato Yoshi fights to survive, foraging for whatever food and supplies he can to take care of his 4 charges. Turtles who will slowly go from being just his weird pets to becoming his sons. Written by Kevin Eastman, yes, one of the TMNT creators themselves showed up to pen this story. This episode could serve as a companion origin story to go along with the pilot. But what elevates this to the top for me mainly is the timing of it. This is one story that just couldn't be told until the last season. Had it come much earlier, it just wouldn't have had the same level of effectiveness. After being with these characters for so long, to then go back and see their humble beginnings, knowing how far they've come, makes this early adventure all the more satisfying. In just under a half hour and with minimal dialogue, we're shown the origin of a great many major things, and minor details as well. From how Raphael got the crack in his shell, to how they picked out their weapons, to how Splinter named them, to how they found the sewer lair, and much more. But most compelling of all is the small character arc that Splinter undergoes. Remember, this is taking place almost right after he was transformed into a rat, so combine that with him having also just lost his wife and daughter, and you can easily imagine just how low he must feel at this point in his life. He even wonders aloud if the higher powers that be have cursed him for some reason. The Turtles are the only source of happiness he has left, and when evil forces threaten to take that away from him too, you can see in his determined expressions that he's finally found something worth fighting for again, and it's all encapsulated in the moment that he stops calling the foursome just the Turtles and for the first time says, "my sons." While my top picks for the 80s and 2003 shows may have been great capsules for the respective series as a whole, this one arguably needs a bit more context to get the full emotional effect. Still, it serves as a great final hurrah before the show's conclusion, and with the Turtles creator behind it, how can you go wrong? All in all, this show feels like the TMNT answer to Ultimate Spider-Man. It takes all the most iconic things from every incarnation that came before, i.e. the comics, live movies, 80s and 2003, and mashes it all together while still giving everything its own unique spin. If you enjoy anime or shows like Cartoon Network's Teen Titans animated series, you'll love this. Hats off to Nickelodeon for letting such a great show be produced on their network. However, this wouldn't be the end of Nick's relationship with the Ninja Turtles, for not long after this series' conclusion, another show was greenlit, one that left the fandom extremely divided, and that series was...